Let's go ahead and open up in prayer, and we will begin. God in heaven, thank you so much that we're here, that we can gather together, learn your word. You are our creator, our savior, our sustainer, and we're ever appreciative for all that you've done for us. And we look forward to the glory that will be revealed to us in opposition to this world's pain, suffering, afflictions, and death. Oh, we thank you that you loved us, cared for us, and gave us not only your Son, but also each other as the church to demonstrate love and compassion to all who we meet, so that we can be an example of who you are, as well as be an encouragement to one another. Help us study your word. So in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so we're going to read the Gospel according to Matthew, not the entire book, but we're going to pick it up in chapter 14. We are dealing with some of the most iconic scenes in the book, including feeding the 5,000, Jesus walking on water, the feeding of the 4,000, the healing of the crowds, the transfiguration, a lot of great content in the next couple of chapters. And we're going to be dealing with Matthew 14 through 17, part 2. I had a part 2, but Pam put them together, so I was kind of part 3-ish, but it's part 2. To remind ourselves, Matthew is an evangelical book to Israel, and the purpose of Matthew is to demonstrate that Jesus is the Christ. If there's one thing that you just grab out of this whole content, the proof is that Jesus is the Christ. That's number one. But there are other purposes, so it's not just one thing, but I would say that this is probably the primary one. The second one is to write an account of the life and times of Jesus Christ. Obviously, not just to demonstrate that he is the Christ, but actually kind of give a story, to give an arc of his chronology, to tell of his life. Probably the main message of the book of Matthew is to introduce, offer, and prepare the Jews for the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is not heaven. The kingdom of heaven is not the spiritual kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is the physical, restored kingdom of Israel, in which the Messiah will reign from Jerusalem, coming soon to a world near you. Next is to prepare the remnant of Israel to survive the time of Jacob's trouble. Time of Jacob's trouble is what we call the Great Tribulation, the 7 years of tribulation, however you want to refer to it. To be messianic or to be kind of dealing with the Hebrew text, it's never called that. So we call it what it's called in the Hebrew text, which is the time of Jacob's trouble. You can also call it Daniel's 70th week or the wrath of the Lamb. These are all kind of the terms that are used for that time period. It's going to be a 7-year period in which Israel will be nearly destroyed along with the rest of the earth. And if God was not graceful and shortened the time itself, because it doesn't last exactly 7 years, by the way, in case you're wondering about that, and he cuts it short. Otherwise, all flesh would be destroyed. So he actually cuts it short. And so who survives this actual tribulational period? Well, the one, Israel, it's called the remnant. Though Israel will be like the sand of the sea, it will be the remnant who will be saved or preserved. And finally, well, not finally, two more things, to validate the testimony and both this testimony and the testimony of all the apostles. So we're reading this kind of understanding the content, but also to understand that all the apostles have an impact, including Paul, even though the 11 are the ones who actually are the witnesses of his sufferings and walked with him from the beginning. And so therefore we can understand Matthew, Mark as basically Peter's testimony, John, and then going into the epistles as well, including James, his brother, but although he was not walking with him from the beginning as well. Finally, to demonstrate in these letters, in this count, that if Israel were to believe in Jesus and accept Jesus as their king, he would bring the kingdom of heaven into fruition. Now they don't. And one of the points we made from Matthew chapter 12, and we will continue to make that point as the book continues, is that I do not believe that the kingdom's offer is been postponed or basically held off, but rather Israel is in a constant state of rejection. And that is a difference from how we say it. because God is perpetually there. It's always been offered, and there's no evidence within the scriptures that it's been withdrawn. What we do see is that they are rejecting it, and therefore God is using the church as a testimony against them, preordained from the beginning, but as a testimony against them that they are not the administration, that the church is the administration of God until he comes back. With that said, let's open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 14, and we'll read verses 1 through 12. Now, again, these are very well-known stories, accounts. And so when you read these accounts, it's important not to just glean too much. Just just skim over too much. You still want to read it and try to understand it based upon the context, the original author, and the original audience to help us understand better the point of the passage and hopefully retain more information as you move forward. Chapter 14, verse 1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the news about Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him." For when Herod had John arrested, he bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, the wife of his brother. For John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Although Herod wanted to put him to death, he feared the crowd, because they regarded John as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod, so much that he promised an oath to give her whatever she asked. Having been prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." Although he was grieved, the king commanded it to be given because of his oaths and because of his dinner guests. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on the platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. His disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and they went and reported it to Jesus. Which always left me the question, did they retrieve the head? Doesn't sound like it. That's weird. I don't know why that concerns me. It just does. I always have those kind of weird questions. So we already know some of this story already. First and foremost, the fame of Jesus had reached all the way to Herod. Now, Herod is obviously the leader of Judea. He is not a Jew. He is an Edomite. We don't have to get into all the history of him, although it's important to understand that even though he was not a Jew, he was considered the leader of the Jews. He was placed in power and position by Rome. When Herod hears the report of Jesus of Nazareth, Herod believes the rumor. Now, it starts out as a rumor. Herod didn't come up with this himself, but he believes the rumor that Jesus is the John the Baptizer risen from the dead. We know this from Luke chapter 9, verses 7 through 9. Now, Herod, the Tetrarch, heard of all that was happening, and he was greatly perplexed, because it was said by some that John had risen from the dead, and by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the prophets of old had risen again. Herod said, "I myself had John beheaded, but who is this man about whom I hear such things?" And he kept trying to see him. So Herod himself hears this rumor and begins believing probably the scariest part about it. Not typical rulers who are not well liked or are always very paranoid. And so he starts seeing this Jesus who has powers and thinks the worst case possible, this is John the Baptist, come back to haunt me, come back to do harm to me. Instead, he kept on trying to see him. And if you furthermore read in context in the Gospels, Herod was trying to see him so that he can put him to death again. Now, the recounting of the death of John the Baptizer is pretty straightforward, and it demonstrates basically two things. Number one, it tells the story. It gives us what happened. If you remember reading Matthew, you introduced with John the Baptizer and what he is saying. He's very confrontational. He deals with the Pharisees, you brood of vipers. He's proclaiming the kingdom of heaven is at hand. We see him baptizing Jesus, and then basically we don't see a whole lot of him. And then in Matthew later on, he comes to Jesus, or actually while in prison, he sends disciples to Jesus, basically asking, "Are you the one? Because I don't see you with your winnowing fork. I don't see you mowing down the opposition here. What are you waiting for?" And then Jesus gives them enough information to take back to John to demonstrate that he is in fact the Messiah. But also, this is here at a particular point. Now, it's kind of strange because of where this is in Mark and where this is in Luke. It's hard to say exactly when this happens because every single one of them has it accounted as if it already happened. It's recounting what already happened. It's not saying this is right after Jesus, after left Judea, then this occurred. So we don't know when John the Baptizer got beheaded. But it's told in strategic points in all of the Gospels, specifically the three synoptics, to demonstrate the severe opposition. And it's always connected with Jesus being rejected at Nazareth. So they take two basic accounts demonstrating the rejection of the message. What message? The message of the kingdom of heaven and its messengers. So Jesus had under him his apostles, but he had them under protection. And so to demonstrate the rejection of Jesus, he goes to his hometown and they try to kill him. He escapes. To demonstrate the rejection of the message through John, they tell the story of Herod beheading him. So here we have the two main individuals who are the announcers of the kingdom of heaven, and they are both being heavily rejected by the most influential people who they're talking to, or in Jesus' case, his hometown. The actual account of the death of John the Baptizer, again, is very straightforward. The content gives the backstory. What happened? Why? So, okay, why would Herod do this? So it tells the story. So John confronts Herod for marrying Herod's brother's wife, Herodias. And why would John care? Is it just because it's a sin? And what we fail to realize many times is that when we're talking about these types of approaches, the Pharisees, he doesn't talk about the people's, or when Jesus talks about the people, he doesn't confront the people's rejection necessarily. He talks about the Pharisaical rejection. He doesn't actually talk about the people in general terms. He directs his attention of their blasphemy to the Pharisees first. Why? Because the Pharisees are the spiritual leadership. They were supposed to be shepherding the people, teaching the people, leading the people, and they failed. Herod is a pseudo-king, but he's still a leader of Israel. And so understanding that we're dealing with the leadership, Jesus' main rejection does not come at the hands of the people, but the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. So we always got to realize that their overall main goal is to talk to the people, but then eventually confront the leadership. John the Baptizer is concerned not just with Herod, but because they're under the law, and the basic concept in the law dealing with the sins of the leader. If a leader sins in Israel, who pays the price? In Leviticus 18:16, you shall not, dealing with the law itself, and in Leviticus 20, I think, you know what? I had these two. I thought I did something different. Basically, going back to the overall principles of the leader. I had the wrong, I changed it. My bad. Whenever you see a leader fail, Saul, David, Solomon, the leaders of Israel, and they fail, good king, bad king, who pays the price? It's always the people. Why? Because back in Exodus 19, the Israeli nation chose to have a representative government. So the representative government is speaking for the people to God. And when those people fail before God, God disciplines the nation. He sends down plagues. He has famine in the land. When David sinned by doing the census against God's instructions, what does he do? He gives David a choice. Here are your three choices. David's not harmed. The people die. Either go to war, or they have famine, or basically a plague specifically demonstrated by God himself. And it's all severe. So the general concept here is that John the Baptizer goes to Herod to deal with his sin specifically because of the potential of God's wrath coming upon the nation because of Herod. Okay. Now Herod was afraid of John. Why? Because the people regarded him as a prophet. Now, if you could read Mark and Luke, they have different flavors of how this is understood. One passage says that Herod liked to listen to John, and perhaps he did, but he still hated John. He didn't like John. But because of the fear, he didn't put him to death. But he still had to go down there, and since he's here, I'll go talk to him every once in a while. When the situation happened, and basically Herodias' daughter demands John the Baptizer's head on a platter, Herod was grieved, and that is the word lupeo. Lupeo is a word that means to cause severe mental or emotional distress. Basically, we call this vexing or irritating. So basically, it's like sadness. Now, was he sad because, oh, I really like John? No, sad because he gets this request, and we know that there's people within his own cabinet, so to speak, his military leaders, and also his wife, and even his daughter, who want this guy dead, but he has the people outside the doors who are numerous, who want him alive. What do? Well, similar to most weak and fearful leaders, he yields to the pressure in front of him, not the potential pressure outside. So I believe he was outside in the crowds and they were all wanting John the Baptist to be released, I'm pretty sure he would have caved to that too. So Herod actually demonstrates his weakness and his fear. So the plan takes shape to behead John the Baptizer. And it's always interesting because, I always ask the question, was this conceit from the onset or what? Or did Herodias take advantage of the situation? No one knows. We really don't know what Herodias goes, hey, you know what? Go out there and dance and he'll give you whatever you want. Therefore, we can ask for John the Baptizer. I think she just saw the opportunity. Hey, Mom, what should I ask for? I know. Get John's head. Now, the overall idea, and again, I don't like to talk about this too much, but the concept of being pleased is attributed to typically lust, but that's not what it means. But I think it can be inferred. So what I want you to understand is that Herod's not a good guy. He is not putting to death reluctantly. He's putting to death reluctantly if he was, due to the fact that he's fearful of the crowds. That's all. So Herod, I even put it up here reluctantly, although I'm not really sure about the word choice there anymore, had John executed, and revealing Herod's weak constitutions, and Herod giving in, not wanting to appear weak before his guests, because it even talks about in that statement there that because of his guests. So he said something, and he goes, I don't want to appear, and so he doesn't really take into consideration what is right or what is wrong. It's all about pressure. That does give us a little bit of an object lesson of what not to be like, but I think we're all very clear on that. And then finally, the story ends with John's disciples retrieved the body and buried his body and reported it back to Jesus, which brings us back full circle as to why this is here. Again, this is not here just to tell a story or to give an account of John the Baptizer. It's put strategically in the location in Matthew to demonstrate that after the acceptance of Jesus, these are the two most extreme examples of Jesus being rejected, first by Nazareth, and also John the Baptizer by Herod, even being put to death. This brings us to the contrast. And I love when the Bible is like, here's a really sad story, and here's a really amazing one. So right after that, and I think it's stated in almost every single account of when this occurs, the feeding of the 5,000 happens. Let's go ahead and read the account. We'll make some observations and hopefully get a little bit of a better understanding of Jesus in his humanity. Verse 13. Now, when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to seclude a place by himself. Now, I'm going to stop right there for a second. The overall intent of the actual lesson is not to basically have Jesus by himself, but actually seclude himself with his disciples. Obviously, his disciples are with him. And so the disciples oftentimes would allow Jesus to go off, and they would kind of stand guard and deal with the people as Jesus go away. So he's leaving a certain area because of just people pressing. They get in a boat and they go off. Mark has a very interesting comment dealing with this about how the people heard about this. They followed him on foot from the cities. How do you and we kind of pondered that. Do you remember that from Mark? We're looking at this account going, how in the world do you follow somebody who's traveling on a lake? And my only suspicion is they could see the boat. That they kind of followed the shoreline. Going out into the deeper waters, more chance of having some severe storms or whatever. So the typical routes are kind of staying by the shore, not doing as the crow flies, so to speak. So they'd be able to see them even from afar, a couple miles out. And they'll kind of just keep on walking. And remember, that's all as they kept on going, they gathered more and more people as they went through the cities. So when people heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when they went ashore, he saw the large crowd. His intent was to seclude himself. Now, maybe he got the seclusion in the boat, but I don't think that was the overall intent based upon the writing. But so they get to the shore, he saw the large crowd, and what? He felt compassion for them and healed their sick. Now, in Mark and Luke, they give the implication as well that basically they went to him having seen the signs from previous situations. They knew who he was, and so the people obviously would want to see more signs. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and the hour is already late. So send the crowds away that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." They said to him, "We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Ordering the people to sit down on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food. Now, I'm not sure if you have an NASB. What do you have the word food? It's italicized. He said a blessing. Blessing is always toward God. He's not blessing the food directly. Good food. We do that, especially if it's good food. But he blessed God. And breaking the loaves, he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. They picked up what was left over in the broken pieces, 12 full baskets. Some people think, well, 12 full baskets, that's cool. One for each of the apostles. They all have leftovers for themselves. I don't know if that's the case. I think they all had 12 baskets going out there. So they were the main servers, and they all came back with 12 full baskets. I don't think it was for the apostles, so to speak. And there were about 5,000 men who ate, beside the women and children. So what's the actual number? Anywhere probably between 7 to 10,000 probably, depending upon if you think every single man had a wife or, at least on average a wife and a child. I would say probably closer to the 7 because not everybody would just bring their wife and child along as they ran after a boat. Just opining. So, beginning this section here, I want to point out that right after this, Jesus walks on the water. So we have 5,000 fed and Jesus walking on the water right after one another. And so right after Jesus being rejected in Nazareth, as being told by the apostles, recounted, right after the account of John the Baptist being beheaded, you have again the 5,000 being fed and Jesus walking on the water. Contrast. It's always fascinating to look for the contrast, looking to see what's happened in rejection, but then also seeing what's happening in the actual evidence. So 2 iconic accounts of Jesus are told. Now, again, you have the entire situation. A large crowd met Jesus on the shore. Now, we find out how large that crowd is, but when he sees the crowd, he felt compassion. Now, compassion is akin to love, but it's not the word love. It's a word that we know regularly. Everyone likes the word because it's fun to say. It's splachnon, or the verb form, splachnidzomai. It's even more fun to say. And what is splachnon? What does the actual word mean? Yeah, that's right. It's your guts. In fact, in another account, when Judas kills himself, he gets gushed in the abdomen, and his splachnon falls out. Same word. So it's literally, if you were to use this kind of language now, saying you move me means something completely different. But we all actually know that when we're actually, and I'll use Sarah as an example. Occasionally, I'll tell her something, I'll say something sweet to her, and she'll say, "You're making my stomach flip." It's doing, that's a butterfly effect, and we don't feel it in the actual heart muscle. We feel it down in the guts, and so they're being very literal when they're talking about the actual feeling, and it is the gut wrench that you feel. And whether it's out of love or mercy, splachnon describes the emotion of that. So you can have mercy for someone and still feel that, because why? Because love is not, okay, well, I'll mature here. Love is not sexual. The word agape, or even phileo, is not a sexual term. Now, there is a word that's translated love that is sexual in reference, and that is the word eros. It's not used in the Bible, and it's still not, it's not the main idea of what we should have as love. In our Western civilization, we automatically tie love to something sexual, and it's perverted. So if I tell someone I love you, you almost have to qualify it. I love you as a brother. I love you as a sister. And that's wrong. We should be able to use the terms and be able to use them appropriately. Mercy is likened to that. You see someone who's in need, and at times you will feel gut wrenched. You'll have that kind of that turning, that feeling that you get because of what you see in that person and the need that they have. Now, we know that Jesus loved them because he was God himself and he had perfect love. But at different times, he also had compassion. And I would say that we need to make sure we understand the difference. Because when we deal with the idea of love and compassion, I can always love, and that's commanded. But it doesn't mean I always feel it. At various different times, I feel it, or I allow myself to be influenced by the love or by the mercy. In Matthew 9:36, Jesus has compassion and primarily of the crowd, because he sees them distressed and dispirited because they have no shepherd. The Pharisees oppressed them and took from them. They were used by the Pharisees, and therefore they're being disheartened and dispirited. So Jesus felt compassion upon them. So what Jesus did in this response is to demonstrate what the leadership was supposed to do. And because they were neglected and failed by the leadership, he had this splachnon. He was gut-wrenched for them. But also the people had needs. Now, it turns out later on they get hungry. But he also has compassion upon them, obviously, because he heals their sick. So the people had needs in other forms as well. And so in response to his compassion, he healed the sick and eventually fed them by multiplying the loaves and the fish. And it's very interesting because Jesus gave, and he gave in abundance. He could have given the exact amount. He knows, could have given the exact amount that was necessary to feed them. Instead, he gives evidence of the multiplication by collecting leftovers. 12 baskets full. Again, 12. Why? Because I believe they sent out 12 baskets and came back with 12 baskets full. So that brings us to two lessons. And this is where we're probably going to be spending most of our time tonight. Two lessons. And I had spent the bulk of my time dealing with the word compassion. And then it kind of led me to other questions because I'm like, man, there's something else here that I was missing for a long time. So here I titled this section here, Lesson to the Disciples. Now, first and foremost, we've already kind of established when the main purposes of Matthew, specifically the feeding of the 5,000, demonstrates an extraordinary proof that he is the Messiah. But if you read from chapter 14 through chapter 16, okay, we have the feeding of the 5,000, walking on water, other statements, 4,000 fed, and then you have Peter's confession. Not that he is the Messiah, but what? What does it say in Matthew chapter 16, verse 15? But who do you say that I am? Verse 16, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So I believe they've already understood and believed that he is the Christ. What I think they're kind of learning, what manner of man is this? Is that he is establishing, so he's developing proof that he is God's son. And that title, Son of God, is something I don't know if they grasp from the prophets, which maybe they should have, but Jesus was giving them extraordinary proof and developing proof that he is actually deity. It's hard to have a man sit right in front of you, dressed like you, looks like you, eats like you, sleeps like you, gets worn out, and go, hey, this is God, the one who created the world. Look at him. It's hard. I can empathize with their difficulty. We can go ahead and go through all the Old Testament to demonstrate that the God's Son is in fact the Messiah. Messiah is God's Son. So if they believed he's Messiah, they should have understood who he was in deity. But this is, I think, something that we overlook, that they're learning this and they're developing this knowledge. But within this text itself, there is a specific contrast that I want to look at. In the earlier portions in Matthew, this contrast is not clear. It's actually not stated, I would say. From this point forward, there is a contrast that is going to be developed. And that contrast is between Jesus and the disciples. Now, whenever you're learning, there's always going to be a contrast. Because you have somebody who doesn't know and somebody who does know. Somebody who doesn't know, somebody who does know. That somebody who knows needs to challenge the person who doesn't know in what they don't know. And how does that get displayed? How do you think it gets displayed most of the time in the Gospels? Two ways: ignorance and error. They say stupid stuff, and Jesus has to correct them. They don't understand. They make mistakes. If you read the first portion of Matthew, say from Matthew chapter 1 through 14, right to this point, you don't see the disciples interact with Jesus a whole lot. They ask a few questions here and there, but they're very obvious questions. Why do you talk to them in parables? It doesn't say anything like Peter says, right? No, you're not going to die, Jesus. Get behind me, Satan. You don't have that type of interaction. But here you can go ahead and actually map out all the interactions from this point, and most of the interactions between Jesus and the disciples are corrective. In order to learn, you almost always have to have a level of mistakes. Because if everyone just sits around and agrees, you never learn anything. I had an interesting conversation yesterday. On Wednesdays, I seem to talk about Tuesday meetings a lot. You think maybe because it was yesterday? I don't know. But we had a significant disagreement. And I'll let you know. I don't think he'll mind. The significant disagreement was between me and Carl. And we went back and forth several times. He called me a couple hours later going, I hope you don't take my feistiness as me just being difficult or I go, absolutely not. I love disagreement, because if you disagree with me, Carl, I take that to heart, not because I'm upset, but because Why is Carl disagreeing with me? What does he see that I don't see? And he treats it the same way. We both respect each other and our ability to read the scriptures and discern it properly. So why are we disagreeing? And so we call up and we talk it out. So disagreement fosters an understanding. Either we develop our understanding together and we come to terms, or we kind of readjust ourselves and better able to explain our points. Disagreement fosters education, fosters learning. So we have here in Matthew chapter 14, what do you have contrasted? It gets late. Disciples are tired. People are hungry. Jesus, send them away. What does it demonstrate about the disciples' mental attitude toward the people? A lack of compassion. If they know who they're dealing with, Jesus, these people are hungry. Can we give them something to eat? But they don't do that. Send them away. Furthermore, in Matthew 14, 26 through 31, Jesus has to confront them directly. We're not going to read all these texts. I'm kind of going to summarize them, but I'll put them all in the text for you. Jesus has to directly confront them because they're fearful. Because Peter goes on the water and begins to doubt and says, where's your faith? You have little faith. Why did you doubt? In chapter 15, verses 12 through 16, we have a text where basically they don't understand. They come to Jesus and says, you know, you're upsetting the Pharisees. And Jesus goes, I don't care. They're wrong. They're blind. Leading the blind. Leave them alone. You also have them explain the parables. And Jesus looks at the disciples and goes, are you still lacking understanding? What don't you understand? In other words, put your thinking caps on. Stop waiting to be spoon-fed. Start thinking through things. In chapter 15, verses 32 through 33, we have the exact same scenario from the feeding of the 5,000. And once again, the disciples go, yeah, where are we going to get them food? Were you just not with me 2 pages ago? I don't know how long it was. In chapter 16, verses 5 through 12, they're actually discussing the fact that they forgot bread. And Jesus goes, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they go, oh, it's because we forgot bread. And Jesus goes, really? Really? You think I'm talking about food? He has to challenge them to demonstrate their ignorance. You of little faith, he says again to them. In chapter 16, verses 21 through 23, right after Peter's confession of Christ, Peter sticks his foot in his mouth and basically saying, you're not going to do that, Lord. And Jesus says, you don't have God's will in mind. You have your will in mind. John chapter 17, verses 4 through 6. This is where Peter's on Mount. It's always Peter, right? Mount of Transfiguration. And right in the middle of Jesus being glorified, and he sees, Elijah and Moses, he goes, hey, let's build a tent for you. We can always come back and visit. Be nice. And God the Father has to rebuke Peter. Peter, this is my son. Listen to him. In other words, shut up. And they heard the voice, and they became extremely fearful. Chapter 17, verses 16 through 20. The disciples can't cast out a demon. And Jesus is going, you perverse, unbelieving generation. What am I going to do with you? Interesting. When we get there, we'll dissect it a little bit more. I don't think it's so much of a chastisement against the disciples as that, but the fact that the disciples couldn't do it, and then afterwards they ask, why couldn't we do it? Because of the littleness of your faith, the lack of your understanding. You don't get it yet. Chapter 18, verses 1 through 3. They're asking about how to become great in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus has to use a child to demonstrate greatness. Chapter 18, verses 21 through 22, Peter comes and asks about forgiveness. Hey, should I go ahead and forgive my brother 7 times? You don't get it, Peter. Again, it seems to always be Peter. Chapter 18, verses 21 to 22. That's the forgiveness, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's where I am. Then you have chapter 19, verses 13 through 15. The disciples rebuked the people from bringing children to Jesus. And Jesus is like, leave them alone. Jesus rebukes them. And chapter 20, verses 24 through 28. You get the idea, right? Jesus, again, talks about greatness in the kingdom and what it takes. It takes humility, self-sacrifice. Chapter 20, 21, verses 20 through 22. Dealing with barren fig tree. And once again, he says, they ask him how the fig tree become barren. And he basically going, don't you understand who I am? Don't you understand who you are and what you're charged with? Demonstrating them that they don't get it yet. So what we have here from chapter 14 through nearly the end is Jesus preparing his disciples, training his disciples specifically to be able to take on their responsibility after he leaves them. Beforehand, we get the content. In chapter 14 and forward, we start seeing a lot of the rebukes and the contrasts and the questions and the errors that the disciples make. God uses the ignorance and the failures of the disciples to teach them and subsequently teach all who would read this account. We can read this, understand what the principles are so that we don't fall into the same traps. So in the actual text itself, we have the example of Jesus Christ given to the disciples and the contrast that is typically used against human nature. Jesus is compassionate. Jesus is bold. Compassionate, we already understand that. I'm going to show you a little bit more later, so I'm not going to really expand upon compassion at this moment. Jesus is bold. He does not go quietly. He speaks out truth regardless of who's around. Jesus is perceptive. He looks around and he sees, he observes, and he makes a proper judgment. The disciples are impetuous, snap decisions. Jesus is in line with the Father's will. He puts aside his own, not my will, but yours be done, as a demonstration to the disciples on how they should also live their lives. Jesus is a servant. He tells them if anyone wants to be great, serve. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve many. Likened to servant is self-sacrificial. He sacrifices of his own time, of his own human flesh, so to speak. He's still human. He still needs to eat. He still needs to rest. And yet he sacrifices himself, not only on the cross, but also of his own ministry to demonstrate for the apostles what it means to be self-sacrificial. In contrast to Peter's question, Jesus is forgiving. Pretty self-explanatory. And then finally, Jesus demonstrates proper leadership. 8 basic lessons that I can go ahead and I put into categories for you. Of all the conversations that you're going to see from this point on with his disciples and what he shows his disciples, it's going to be one of these 8 basic concepts in which they need to understand. Now, here's the more beautiful thing. All of these 8 are repeated in some form or fashion in the epistles, not just in Paul, but in Peter's letters, James's letters, John's letters. This becomes kind of the mantra. All these different lessons are repeated regularly. And so as we kind of go through these lessons and these different lessons that they learn, we're going to take a little time making sure that we don't just put them into context of history, Because remember, we emphasize this, that we have to make sure we understand it in accordance with what they needed to hear, what they needed to see. The disciples needed to see the 5,000 fed. Why? Because they needed to understand and grasp the idea that this Messiah is also the Son of the living God, and it comes to fruition in chapter 16. But they also needed to understand about how to function as the apostles in compassion. I even looked at Mark, remember? It says Jesus trained his disciples in Mark, and he's training them in organization, remember? Because he'd have them set down in 50s and 100s. Easier to control. They can manage it a lot easier. Because once they leave, they get thousands following them. And these seemingly untrained individuals are all of a sudden organizing thousands of people in Judea. Fascinating. But what is the eternal truth? And again, we're going to be dealing with compassion this time. And compassion is splachnomai, or splachnon. And there's two other irregular cognates combining you or as good, find that in Ephesians. And you also have a poly splachnon, which basically means many compassions. We're not going to look at that verse tonight. So here's the first question I want to ask you. In what way does God splachnon, if you can kind of use that in this kind of English format, to us? How does God demonstrate splachnon to us? What's your first input? What's your first thought? Cross. I thought so too. Don't you love when you know you're being baited? I love it. Yeah, I know what you want me to say, and I don't want to say it because I think you're just setting me up for failure. Now, if I said, in what way does God demonstrate his love? That's easy, is it not? Why? Because we have verses in Romans chapter 5. But splachnon is never used in regards to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross, ever. Why? And in what way does God show compassion, we'll say it like that, to us? Well, the word splachnon itself, if you go through the text, seem to actually be direct and immediate impact in this life. In this life. Not in the eternal state, not in our eventuality, not a spiritual truth. And this is where I've had disagreements with people. I love people. Now, this wasn't what we had on Tuesday, just different individuals. And that is the idea of God emoting upon you. Meaning that I've experienced, for lack of a better term here, the splachnon of God while praying. And I disagreed. I said, you may have felt your own splachnon activate, but did you feel the splachnon of God? How would you differentiate? And they don't have an answer. Why? Because I don't believe that this is stated in this manner in the text. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, we're going to go to Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and 1 Peter, in case you're wondering. Ephesians 4:32, a verse that's well known to everybody. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, and remember that's not forgiving each other, that is gracing each other out, just as Christ also has graced you out. Okay? Tender-hearted is splachnon, and it's actually used splachnon in this text, but I think it's basically an emphatic use. Remember, being kind is actually not really just, hey, that's a nice shirt. It's actually the word helpful. So Ephesians 4:32 is helpful and compassionate, showing grace to one another, just as God in Christ has shown grace to you. So we're giving instructions as to how we function to one another using the example of Jesus and understanding what Christ has done for us in this term, the charizomai. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, we obviously, again, very well-known passage. Therefore, if there's any encouragement in Christ, if there's any consolation of love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and compassion, splachnon, or splachnizomai. Actually, this is splachnon here. Make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. In the same mind here, all this activity is being of the same mind, the mind of Christ, later discovered in Philippians 2:5-9. Colossians chapter 3, this is a little bit lengthier. I didn't want to separate this one out. This is just a fantastic passage. Colossians 3:12-17. So as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, showing grace to one another. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord showed grace to you, so also should you. Beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity, demonstrating that love and compassion, although connected, are not the same. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called into one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ richly dwell within you with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Whatever you do, in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. Simple synopsis: the responsibility and the goal of the life of the believer, captured in many different terms. If you think of the word splachnon, have you ever remember taking on Philemon? Splachnon, or a cognate of it, is used 3 times in that very short little book. Paul calls Philemon his gut wrench, and also dealing with Onesimus. In 1 Peter 3:8-9, see our last text. To sum up, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, giving a blessed instead, for which you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. Sympathetic, compassionate. So, what do we observe in our conclusion? We looked at all these verses. These are dealing with these are pretty much all the references in the epistles. In the Gospels, they're all used when Jesus is having compassion upon somebody, and he does something for them. He heals them from their blind. He heals their sick. He feeds them. So, if we want to kind of connect the dots, what does splachnon involve? Splachnon involves service. It is kind of like that you allow yourself to be impacted by love and mercy. I love you, and I can truly love all of you, but I can't show splachnon to every single one of you. And so at a time when it becomes necessary, I allow myself to become overwhelmed, or to be whelmed, if you will, not over necessarily, to be whelmed up by the love, by the mercy that we're supposed to have for one another when the need hits, so that the interest becomes active. So yes, it's an emotional word, but it's an active word. And it seems to involve doing a service to fellow believers because of the love that we have. And what we say in our last kind of statement here, Jesus in his humanity is our example. So as we learn about his messiahship, his being deity, the functions of Jesus, we're also learning about the activity of the man himself and how he conducted himself on earth as an example to his disciples and apostles, but also most of those activities and the intent behind them, what was behind the activity, because we can't walk on water, we can't reproduce fish and bread. And even if I could reproduce fish, I'd be like, I don't think so. Where's the steaks? I'll reproduce those, right? We can't reproduce the activity. We're not going to try to be Christ-like in his deity or in his being a prophet of the Messiah, but we are imitators of Christ in his love, in his compassion, in his boldness, in his being aligned with the will of God, being a servant, self-sacrificial, forgiving, not just being graceful, but the forgiving part as well. So you have both the athemi and the charizomai. And within the leadership specifically, not only to the apostles, but to those who take it on, proper biblical leadership. It's all laid out for us. So I hope this is helpful. For now, let's go ahead and pray. We'll go ahead and pick it up with Jesus walking on the water in Matthew 14 next week. Heavenly Father, thank you for your truth, that we're able to read, make observations, see how you act and interact with your apostles and your disciples. See if we can do words and look at understandings and how you wanted them to be displayed, given by your apostles and read by the intended audience. But then we have it here, 2,000 years later, to study, to observe, to connect the dots, so that not only can we understand who you are, but we can be better representatives of who you are, to build each other up, and to be a witness to those outside. We thank you and praise you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.